Let's take you to Kathmandu now. At least 13 people have been killed and dozens injured in the Nepali capital during a protest against the government's decision to block dozens of social media platforms.
Nepal's Prime Minister, Sharma Oli, has resigned after violent protests broke out on Monday over a social media ban.
Nepal is burning, and the country hasn't seen this kind of bloodshed since the Civil War. What started as a simple protest against corruption quickly turned into a nightmare when Nepali police officers opened fire without mercy, killing 19 people in just a few minutes. Some of those victims were barely teenagers, some still in school uniforms. Their only crime was trying to get home. This wasn't just police violence. It was a massacre. And now Nepal was about to show the government what hell really looked like. What followed looked like less of a protest and more like a manhunt. Politicians were hunted one by one. Their mansions, their offices, were set on fire. The most powerful, the prime minister, the president, and senior ministers with their families were evacuated out of Kathmandu to undisclosed locations. Others weren't so lucky. Ministers caught on the streets were dragged, chased, and beaten by hundreds of Nepali kids. Gen Z, teenagers, the very people who grew up listening to the promises of a new Nepal that never came. So, what the hell is happening? Why are Nepal's youth, teenagers, college kids, risking their lives and setting their cities on fire? This is really all because the government banned social media for a week? Or is there something much deeper going on? Something that the mainstream media aren't telling you? To be honest, nobody sets fire to Parliament just because they couldn't scroll Instagram. Social media bans were the spark, yes, but the powder keg has been filling for years. And this explosion is about much more than apps. It's about corruption, nepotism, and an entire generation that feels its future has been stolen from them. Nepal's entire political line was always rotting with corruption since the day it began. But this time, it wasn't the politicians themselves who pushed people over the edge. It was their children, the sons and daughters of the elite, flaunting luxury cars on social media, showing off at lavish parties, posting photos from Europe and Dubai, flashing the kind of wealth no ordinary Nepali could ever dream of. That arrogant show-off hit like a slap in the face. While ordinary families were scraping just to put 2 meals a day on the table, parents sold land or went into debt to send a child abroad for work, they were forced to watch their taxes fund somebody else's champagne lifestyle. To truly understand Nepal's problem, you first need to know a bit about its history. Nepal was a Hindu monarchy for more than 2 centuries, ruled by the Shah dynasty since the 18th century. Kings were treated as semi-divine guardians of the nation. By the late 20th century, that era had collapsed. In 1990, after a mass uprising, Nepal became a constitutional monarchy with a multi-party democracy, though the king still pulled a lot of strings. That compromise never worked. Governments changed constantly, corruption only deepened, and in 1996, the Maoists launched their insurgency. For 10 years, Nepal was in a civil war. The Maoists on one side, the monarchy-backed state on the other. Over 17,000 people were killed. Entire regions destabilized, and the country was exhausted. A peace deal in 2006 brought the war to an end. 2 years later came what many thought was a new beginning. In April of 2008, Nepal held elections for a constituent assembly tasked with writing a new constitution. The Maoists shocked everybody by winning the largest share of seats. And in its very first meeting on May 28th, the assembly voted 560-4 to abolish the 240-year-old monarchy. King Gyanendra was told to leave the palace within 15 days, and Nepal was declared a federal democratic republic. Unfortunately, this democracy turned out to be just as useless. In the last 15 years, Nepal has gone through 14 governments. Yes, 14, with no prime minister ever completing a 5-year term. Each one came in, stayed a year or two, filled their own pockets, and got thrown out. Year after year, promises were made, and year after year, those same promises were broken. Gen Z, the very ones now fighting and dying in the streets, have never known what a stable government even looks like. All they've ever seen is poverty that feels impossible to escape. For the last 3 decades, youth unemployment has averaged nearly 20%. Even for those lucky enough to find a job, wages are pitifully low, barely enough to feed a family 2 meals a day, let alone pay for an education, medical care, or a safe roof over their heads. The same goes for poverty as well. Nearly 1 in 5 Nepalese still live below the poverty line, scraping by on less than $2 per day. Almost half of the population, more than 15 million people, don't have reliable access to nutritious food. And Nepal is among the countries with the highest levels of chronic malnutrition in South Asia. Over a third of all Nepali children under 5 are stunted, permanently held back by a lack of proper nutrition during their crucial early years. Nearly 80% of Nepali families continued cooking over open fires, inhaling smoke that leads to severe respiratory diseases, one of the country's biggest killers. Nearly a quarter of all households lack access to safe drinking water, forcing women and children to fetch water from polluted streams or distant taps. This is why, for decades, young Nepalis have had no choice but to leave their homes and families behind and migrate in search of work. In fact, government data recently indicated that about 2,000 young Nepalese were leaving the country every single day in search of work in the Gulf, in Malaysia, in India, or anywhere for a decent wage. Go to any village and you'll find mostly the elderly and children, because the working age folks are off earning in a foreign nation. To put this into perspective, around 10 to 15% of Nepal's entire population, nearly 4 million of its youngest, strongest, and most capable citizens, are living and working abroad, sending money home to sustain their families. Sadly, even after escaping the poverty of their homeland, Nepali workers often find themselves trapped and forced into dangerous workplaces, paid late or not at all, and housed in crowded, unsanitary quarters. In Qatar alone, an estimated 1,600 Nepali migrant workers lost their lives between 2011 and 2020, building stadiums and infrastructure projects that they'd never personally benefit from. Yet, even with all of these dangers, leaving remains a necessity rather than a choice. The money these workers send home, small amounts earned through immense sacrifice, quite literally keeps Nepal's economy afloat. Remittances now account for roughly 1/3 of the entire national GDP, one of the highest proportions in the world. Without this foreign-earned cash, Nepal's fragile economy would simply collapse. Though the social media ban wasn't the main reason for the protests, it did play an emotional role. Millions of Nepali families relied on apps like WhatsApp and Facebook to stay connected to loved ones working abroad. They were how a mother in a rural village could see her son's face as he labored on a construction site in Dubai, or how kids in Kathmandu heard their father's voice while he worked night shifts in a Malaysian hospital. So when the Nepali government abruptly shut down 26 major social media apps, they didn't just block online conversations. They shattered millions of precious connections overnight. It was an unnecessary wound Nepal inflicted on itself at the worst possible moment. But in reality, tensions had been building long before the ban. Weeks earlier, a narrative called nepo kids had exploded across Nepali social media. The term nepo baby usually refers to Hollywood stars' kids who get a free ride. This was just the Nepali version of that. This was the first real spark for Gen Z, because you can't expect someone to stay quiet when they're poor, jobless, with no future, and then they see kids their own age rolling around in luxury cars in London or Dubai, partying, spending tens of thousands like it's pocket change. These weren't kids with jobs or businesses. There was no legitimate way to justify their lavish lifestyle. The only explanation was that taxpayers' money was quietly being funneled into their pockets through their parents' positions. Take Shrinkala Kathiawada as an example. In 2008, she was crowned Miss Nepal and went on to represent the country at Miss World. At the time, the media carefully crafted a narrative about Shrinkala, portraying her as the small-town girl who rose from humble beginnings, driven, determined, and hard-working, the embodiment of merit and perseverance. Articles represented her as the relatable girl next door who achieved success purely through sheer willpower, a role model for other Nepali girls. But what those glowing stories conveniently left out was Shrinkala's family background. Shrinkala's father is Burot Kathiawada, a senior politician who has been an MP for years, and even served as Nepal's Minister of Health and Population. Her mother, Munu Sigdel Kathiawada, is also politically active, holding positions in the CPN-UML party and in Bagmati's province parliament. Now, that doesn't mean that Shrinkala didn't work hard or that her achievements weren't real. She's an architect by training, studied at Harvard, and performed impressively on the global stage. But you can't ignore how much easier doors open when you grow up in a political family with money, networks, and influence. Perhaps the most infamous example was Saugut Thapa, the son of a politician Bindu Kumar Thapa. A viral video showed him building an extravagant Christmas tree entirely out of luxury brand boxes. Gucci, Louis Vuitton, you name it. Now, if his father officially earns less than $1,000 a month, how on earth does the son afford such extravagant purchases? For Gen Z, this was proof that their taxes were being siphoned to fund someone else's toys. With dozens of similar cases surfacing, every new revelation makes the protests even more personal. And it didn't matter which party somebody belonged to. Gen Z GOP spared no one. They dug into every politician, exposing that while the nation bled and suffered, a tiny circle of elites and their children were living like royalty. By late August, youth activism online was surging. There was talks of taking the frustration to the streets. These young people wanted their future, their country, back from the kleptocrats and their spoiled children. Conveniently, right as the Nepo Kids campaign was exploding online, the government decided it was time to regulate social media. On August 28, 2025, the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology issued a sudden directive that all social media platforms had 7 days to register with Nepali authorities or face a shutdown. That meant opening a local office, hiring staff, appointing a grievance officer, and agreeing to hand over data under Nepali law. This wasn't a request, it was a threat. Do it in a week or disappear. Now, officials claimed this was about accountability, like stopping fake accounts, hate speech, and scams. And to be fair, they weren't entirely making that up. A Supreme Court order had indeed recently asked the government to better regulate social media after concerns about misinformation. But the timing of enforcing this and the extreme way they did it raised a lot of suspicion. Predictably, most big tech companies did not manage to register on such short notice. I mean, setting up a local office and bureaucracy in a week? That's not easy, especially if you suspect the government is hostile. Only a few complied in time, like TikTok, which had actually registered months earlier, and a few smaller apps like Viber. Everyone else, they missed the deadline. So, true to its word, the government shut them down. On September 4th, Nepal banned 26 major social media and messaging platforms. This included almost every app young Nepalis use daily: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, Reddit, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Signal, Discord, Pinterest, Telegram, you name it. It was probably on the list. Even lesser-known ones like Clubhouse and Tumblr were blocked. Overnight, nearly the entire spectrum of online communication went dark. Internet service providers were ordered to cut access immediately. The outrage was instant. For youth already furious over corruption, it looked like an open attempt to silence them. After weeks of Nepo Kids posts exposing political families, the timing felt way too convenient. The government had effectively declared war on its own Gen Z. So the kids decided to take the fight off the screens and onto the streets. One of the government's biggest mistakes was not shutting down every social media platform. Since TikTok and Viber remained accessible, protesters instantly turned them into powerful mobilization tools. Through TikTok videos and good old-fashioned SMS text messages, phone calls, and word of mouth, plans came together for a nationwide protest. The organizers, basically informal networks of students and young professionals, called it simply a Gen Z demonstration. No central leadership, no political banners, just thousands of young faces united by frustration. Many carried Nepal's national flag, and others held handmade placards demanding justice and change. By late morning on September 8th, tens of thousands of protesters were already marching towards the parliament building in Kathmandu. Some had come directly from classrooms, still dressed in their school uniforms, determined not to miss this historic moment. Reports say the protesters were loud but largely peaceful, until a group of them surged forward, broke through the barriers, and pushed open a gate left partially unsecured. Before security could respond, protesters were inside the parliament compound itself, and that's when all hell broke loose. The use of live rounds on unarmed protesters was something Nepal hadn't seen in years. The last time the state spilled that much blood in the streets was during the 2006 People's Movement, when King Gyanendra had seized direct rule and sent security forces to crush mass rallies demanding the return to democracy. Kathmandu went under curfew. Commanders issued shoot-on-sight orders to keep people off the roads. Police and soldiers fired into crowds. By the time the parliament was finally restored on April 24th, independent monitors counted roughly 18 people killed during those April demonstrations and about 4,300 injured. When the monarchy felt cornered, it answered with bullets. This time, the government did the same thing. On September 8th, police confirmed 19 people dead, 7 in Kathmandu and 2 in Ittihadi. Many were heartbreakingly young, some teenagers shot in the head and chest. This massacre became the turning point. News of the killings spread fast, and public fury spread even faster. Instead of scaring people into submission, the violence seemed to have hardened their resolve. By late afternoon, the Kathmandu district administration had imposed a curfew around core government zones. But crowds held their ground, and then marches carried into the night despite no protest orders. Within hours, Home Minister Ramesh Lakhak, the cabinet minister in charge of the police, resigned, saying he was taking responsibility. But protesters, they were still furious. They didn't trust their government to investigate anything honestly, and they were too furious to wait for inquiries. Nobody slept that night, neither the public nor the politicians. With each passing minute, thousands more poured into the streets. By dawn, Nepal had turned into hell. Protests erupted in almost every corner of the country. And in Kathmandu, the streets were flooded, not just with students, but the elderly too. What followed looked less like a protest and more like retribution. The state and its parties were hunted. Mobs broke into parliament itself and set it on fire. By afternoon, smoke from the legislature was visible across the city. Elsewhere, crowds targeted homes and offices of leaders across party lines. The house of Prithvi Subhagarang, the very minister who signed off on the social media ban, was torched. Deputy Prime Minister Bishnu Paudell's residence was attacked. The Nepali Congress headquarters went up in flame, and protesters stormed the home of the former Prime Minister Sher Bahadur. To them, he was no different than the ruling elite. His wife was serving as foreign minister at the time, and together they were seen as a corrupt power couple. Video later surfaced of both of them being attacked in their home. Sher Bahadur bloodied, his shirt red, as the two huddled in a field waiting to be airlifted out. Even bureaucrats weren't spared. The central bank governor's house was trashed. If you were part of the ruling elite, the mob wanted you gone. Run away, they shouted, as ministers literally did. Speaking of running away, in one viral clip, an army helicopter was seen hovering over a house where some ministers and their families were trapped. The chopper couldn't land in the mob, so it dropped a rope sling. And there on camera, you see 2 or 3 people dangling from a single rope under the helicopter as it flies away. The fear on their faces was real. But for those who didn't make it to the helicopters, there was no such mercy. Caught in the streets, ministers were dragged out, beaten, and humiliated by furious crowds. By the end of September 9th, the entire government authority had collapsed. The communications ministry rushed to announce that the social media ban was lifted, but it was too late. The youth had tasted blood, figuratively and literally, and they wanted more than Facebook back. The remarkable and dangerous thing was that this movement had no single leader. It was spontaneous, leaderless, and impossible to pin down. That made it harder to stop, but also riskier. With no clear demands or structure, it could fizzle, or worse, be hijacked by opportunists with their own agendas. Still, one thing was undeniable. Gen Z had made its point. They could shake the country to its core. And now the question was, what's next? Well, at the time of writing the script, talks were underway between the president, the army chief, and youth representatives to shape an interim government. The strongest name on the table was Susila Karaki, a former chief justice, respected for her independence and anti-corruption record. Protest leaders had proposed her to head a caretaker administration. And by most accounts, she had agreed in principle. Kathmandu's mayor, Balin Shah, was briefly considered but stepped aside to endorse her. Whoever it is that steps up next, one thing is certain. Nepal's younger generation has lost its fear. They've seen their own power, and they've also seen the price. 19 dead, hundreds injured, classmates and friends turned into martyrs. That memory will fuel them for decades. What Nepal's Gen Z managed to do in a single week is now a part of history. They toppled a prime minister, set parliament ablaze, and forced the world to pay attention. Most youth movements force concessions, maybe a resignation or two. Here, they overthrew a government. Nepal is lucky it didn't spiral into something darker, like China's 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and massacre, where hundreds and possibly thousands of students were murdered. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you've ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or a faceless channel, now's kind of the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to get started and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. And that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one YouTube video for completely free. So, if you are someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can watch that video here on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description or the card on your screen.